Welcome to the Faith is Not Blind podcast. I'm Eric Devonier, and I'm here with David Pulsifer, professor of history at BYU, Idaho. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a seventh generation Latter-day Saint. Grew up in the Salt Lake area. Makes me very uninteresting in terms of how, in terms of my church background. But I grew up in the Salt Lake area, went to BYU, served a mission in Pennsylvania, been married for about 27 years, have 6 children, live here in Rexburg, been here about 22 years. It's been a wonderful life.
Well, that's great. So tell me, what got you interested in history?
In history? That's an interesting question because I don't know that I had any moment where history suddenly grabbed me, and but I grew up with a deep sense of the family history, and then I served a mission in Pennsylvania where I served in Gettysburg. We also served in the our mission had the site of the priesthood restoration, and I think there was just kind of an ethos of historical experience that seemed to follow me wherever I went, and over time that just seemed to be the natural place where I gravitated to. I wasn't necessarily really into history as a child or a teenager, and even at BYU I studied American Studies, which is a study of American culture more than it is American history. But over the course of my graduate work, I gradually shifted more from literature into history, and then ended up being hired here to teach history. I think it was more in the teaching of history than anything that I really discovered an interest in it. So.
Yeah. What was it about the teaching of history that stood out to you, or that attracted you to it?
I've always just been interested in the human experience, and in the lives of individuals who've shaped the world in one way or another, mostly those who have left positive impact on the world. And I think in many ways my search for history has also been connected to my search for God. Understanding the human experience helps me understand the mortal experience and the divine a little bit better. So.
And in that searching for God and for truth, tell us a little bit about your background with the church. You're 7th generation member of the church. You have a long family history. But what about for you personally growing up? How did your testimony develop?
Well, I was, as a very young child, I felt very close to God. I was I never had any particular questions about, God's existence or anything. I felt that God was there, deeply involved in my life. As I grew into my teenage years, and I had parents. I had a father in particular who always was very open with us about his own spiritual experiences. I grew up with, I knew I had a father who felt the Spirit, felt revelation in his life, and would share those experiences with me. I knew I had ancestors that had experiences.
Yeah.
And then I also, I had on my mother's side another kind of rich legacy that went back as well. And I had a grandmother who served actually in the as one of the general officers of the church. She was General Young Women's president. And so I kind of, I felt her testimony and faith growing up. When I was in my teenage years, however, I was sitting in seminary one day, a 15-year-old sophomore, and I went to a school that was 70% LDS, so we had a big seminary class. And I remember sitting in there and thinking suddenly, and I don't even know what prompted it. It seemed to literally come out of left field, no preparation for it. I had the thought, what if this whole thing is a hoax? And it startled me because I had always felt close to God as a child, and I realized in that moment that I no longer knew if there even was a God. It wasn't just, what if Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon is a hoax? What if God doesn't exist? And I had this startling revelation that I didn't know if God existed anymore. And that kind of started a process for me to find out. So I began making changes in my life that I realized I had stopped praying. I wasn't really living according to the truth that I had known as a child. And so I think I trusted enough in my childhood memories to know that maybe there was something I could recover if I worked hard enough at it.
And so you went through that process. I mean, that's really interesting because you're surrounded by, all of the, you would imagine the external influences that could help faith continue, right, and keep going. But you just have this one sort of split-second existential crisis, and that leads you to asking these questions. And so from there, how did you go about recovering that faith?
Well, it involved making some changes in my life, and more particular, I began to pray. But the thing that was hard was I didn't know if anyone was actually listening. So I began praying without any real sense that my prayers were going any further than the ceiling of my bedroom. But I began reading the scriptures. We happened to be in the Book of Mormon that year, and my seminary teacher, called me into his office at the end of the year and said, "I'll give you an A," which I didn't deserve at all. He says, "if you promise me you'll read the Book of Mormon by the end of the summer." And of course, the summer went by, and about August, I realized that I hadn't been reading the Book of Mormon, and I started reading it feverishly, because wanting to be true to that promise. If nothing else, really at that point, I started reading it feverishly. I literally finished it 15 minutes before school started, and was able to go in and tell him I finished the Book of Mormon.
Wow.
But that next year was the Old Testament. And it may seem strange, but that was the year that I really discovered the scriptures. The Old Testament became the place where I really fell in love with the scriptures. And I continued to pray, but at the same time, I was enjoying my scripture study. I was praying, but I still really had no clear sense that God really existed.
Yeah.
And later that year, I received because I was, from all outward appearances, if you'd known me, you would have thought there was nothing going on, because I was that kid who kind of knew the answers in Sunday school, even a kind of smart alecky kid who kind of knew the answers in the Sunday school. So by all outward appearances, I looked like I was, the model young man in priesthood, but I really inside was going through, I didn't know. So my junior year, at the end of my junior year, I was called to be, in my high school, it was called the seminary student body, or the seminary council president, which, because we had so many, and we had a relief time seminary, it was kind of like receiving an assignment to be like in a shadow student body group, and my responsibility was to call everybody else and to find out who God wanted to have on the council.
Oh, wow.
And that created a major problem for me,
Sure.
because I didn't know if God was really there, and if he was, how to know if he was speaking to me. So I was really blessed to have a good mentor in the seminary advisor, who was David Schuler, and he listened to me and coached me and walked me through it. I accepted the calling and then started the process of going through, studying it out in my mind, trying to figure out who. And to make a very long story short, after many attempts at prayer that had failed, one night, as I went to the Lord in prayer, because one of the things that I had been struggling with is, how do I know if it's emotion or the Spirit?
Right. Yeah.
That was my biggest quandary.
Yeah.
How can I tell if this is coming from inside of me or if it's coming from externally? And I had no way of discerning that difference. And one night when I went to the Lord in prayer for the very first time, I felt a Spirit that came in and confirmed some things that the specific things I was praying about. But that, in the end, wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing for me was I felt the power of God's love in such a way that I knew it was from beyond me. I had no doubt that was coming from outside of me. It was like, and the thing that was most shocking to me at that moment was to realize that I'd been feeling this my whole life. I just hadn't recognized it, that it was like the volume got turned up.
Right. But how valuable, right, to know it for yourself, because in some ways, having all of the externalities, right, of the church, and being so ensconced, in some ways can sometimes maybe keep you, right, from having a personal response or a personal relationship, or to know for sure individually, and you were able to find that.
And I needed that. I couldn't continue on without that. I had to know. I came to the point where I had to know for myself, and that was, growing up with all of that around. But part of it, growing up with everything around me, led me to know that I could, or at least gave me hope that I could know. Yeah. I could have that experience. I could have a personal experience. So I left that night knowing that God was real and God was in relationship with me. And if that was true, he was in relationship with everyone. And I didn't know anything else beyond that, but I knew that. And I had and that, I've never had an experience to that level again. That became kind of an anchor to which I've gone back repeately. So.
Well, and that anchor, it's interesting coming back to history and your love of history and American culture. There are people who have a lot of historical issues, right, with church history and those types of things. There are things like in every history, it's hard to know exactly what happened, right, and putting together pieces. And
we can never know for sure.
Yeah, you can never know for sure. And there are some historical questions that are difficult, historical questions that pose a lot of challenges for people. So as you have that, foundational experience with the Spirit, with your testimony, have you had any experiences with any of the tensions that we see between, the church and church history in particular?
Well, that's something that's been essentially a part of my whole life. The difficult problems of church history are an integral part of my family history. So I'm a seventh generation Latter-day Saint, but one of those generational lines goes back to John D. Lee. So I'm a descendant of a man who helped, orchestrate the murder of 120 people, and did it in the name of his faith, right? And I've known that since I was a very small child. I can remember learning about it when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. I'm not sure exactly how old. So
just for those that don't know, right? Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Right. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, right? Yeah. So my great grandfather organized it. Right? He was the principal leader on the ground for that experience. And then
for you, that's a combination of your love of history, right? Your love of the study of humanity in the past and those narratives, and then also the family narrative, right? I mean, that just
right. And the family narrative was interesting because the family narrative growing up was that he did nothing wrong. The family was in denial, largely about his role. And there was a very strong family narrative that wanted to exonerate him, that wanted to say, well, his gun didn't go off, and there's no way to prove that he actually killed anybody, and he was a good man.
Yeah.
And I remember even as a child wrestling with that, because it didn't seem quite right. That narrative didn't seem quite right. On the other hand, the idea that he was a total monster, that he was a depraved, sadistic man didn't seem right either.
Right.
And actually the very first historical thing, very first academic paper that I ever published, it was in the student journal at BYU, was an essay grappling with these two versions of my grandfather.
Wow.
And trying to say, isn't there some way that we can understand him as a complex human being, as a person who had deep faith and was trying to do what was right, but also somebody who made some really serious errors, in part based upon the very things that made him a strong defender of the faith. Those very same character traits are also what leads him down a really horrific road and some really tragic choices that he makes. And I was pushing back against both I found myself pushing against the extremes, those who wanted to paint him in this really awful light, and those who wanted to in my family, that wanted to just redeem him and exonerate him of any responsibility in the what happened. And it seemed to me, I think I didn't realize it at the time, but that's kind of where I began really formulating my sense that history's messy and complicated, and that we can, that the whole picture is usually embraces both the good and the bad.
Yeah. So that's a very personal example, right, of that messiness of history, the nuances of history, because it seems like, and you can respond to this if I'm out of bounds, but it seems like the farther away we get from a historical moment, the easier it is, I think, to us to look past the nuances and to want to categorize quite quickly. I mean, it just makes the narrative of history easier, right? To follow along if we know who the good guys are, the bad guys are. This is someone we don't like, some historical figure. When in fact, as an expert in history, what you find as you go back, that there are things around the narrative, maybe above and below the narrative, that challenge some of those labels we want to put on things that we weren't there to witness.
Right. I mean, I ask myself all the time, because it's in my DNA. My ancestor did this, made these choices. What choices would I have made if I'd been back there? If I'd been in the heat of that moment, would I have had the courage to push against the mob mentality that basically took over, or would I have gone along with it? And the tragic thing is can't really say for sure which way I would have gone. I would like to hope that I would have had the courage to there were a few that did, not my ancestors, but others who stood up and said, no, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing this. But they were the minority, and most of the people went along with it, and they went along with it in part because they thought they were protecting their community, and they thought they were doing something good, but in the end they doing something horrible. So knowing the complexity helps me realize that we all have the division of good and evil running through our own hearts, and we make choices all the time which lead us to one side or the other.
Yeah, so it sounds like that nuance, right, and that understanding that we all have that part of us, and then what you're watching in particular with your relative with the Mountain Meadows Massacre is, how does that happen? How does someone who you believe is faithful and good end up doing something that is tragic at best,
right?
And
horrific.
But it sounds like that understanding that nuance also, as you look back in time, helps with your testimony. Understanding that doesn't affect your belief in the gospel as much as it does I mean, it doesn't affect your testimony or your sense of the gospel as much as it does understanding how human beings respond in a particular historical moment.
Yeah, I think partly because I knew these things were a part of our family history, and partly because I had a grandmother again who was kind of in the upper echelons of church leadership, and I grew up with no illusions that there were perfect leaders, and I knew that there's a difference between God and his human servants, right? And that that just because people make poor choices or do things, as we all do, doesn't negate God's reality and his efforts to reach out to his children and to guide them and direct them through imperfect vessels and so on. So seeing, for me, my faith is actually strengthened by looking at the good that God does with such imperfect beings. I mean, I look at John D. Lee, who, for all of his faults, still was an instrument for good in many instances. Obviously, in this instance, he was kind of betraying the truth, but in many other instances, he was an instrument in God's hands to do good in the world. And being able to hold both of those ideas at the same time, in some ways actually gives me hope, because I'm so imperfect, and knowing that maybe I can be an instrument at some time in God's hands to do good, even though I'm oftentimes making choices that hurt and are not helpful. But
And so let me ask you this question. So with this background, thinking about your experience with looking back at your ancestor and looking through history, how do you help your students gain that type of insight, either with history itself or with church history in particular?
one of the things I focus with constantly with students is that history is complex, and that a good historian, and the historians that I respect, are ones who approach history with a high degree with two really important qualities. One is humility, a sense that we don't know everything. And because we can't know everything, there are elements of human lives and decisions and circumstances that we'll just never be able to access from our point in history. So we always have to go in with the sense that what we know is limited, and any interpretation of the past that we come up with is going to be provisional. It's always going to be likely subject to change. So so you start with humility, and then the second thing is the best historians always go to their subjects with a high degree of charity. They need to be willing to see the past through the lens of forgiveness and charity. I discovered this as a student in graduate school. I was studying the anti-polygamy legislation that had been passed in Congress in the 1880s, and then court decisions. And I have another grandfather, ancestor, who was the first case that was prosecuted for polygamy. So I grew up with polygamy in Mountain Meadows. So
Wow,
so they were just kind of always in the background of the family story. And so there was never a moment when those kind of burst onto my mental stage.
Right.
So I'm studying these court cases, and I'm reading these congressional debates, and I'm angry at the way in which certain hypocrisies were coming out. Members of Congress who had mistresses and countenanced all sorts of immoral acts, who are then calling on Latter-day Saints as highly immoral beings, and I remember just getting angrier and angrier, and I couldn't understand how they could be so cruel to my people, as I saw it. It's being very
Right.
tribal.
Right.
And as I'm sitting, I can still remember sitting in the University of Minnesota government section of their library, which is always like in the dungeon of every library, and sitting there at this big metal table and reading these debates, because nothing was online at that point. I'm reading them in the books, and I'm getting angrier and angrier. And I remember having a moment where I almost heard a voice. It felt like, but the message was clear. I didn't hear an actual, physical voice, but the message came very clear to me. You have to forgive them. And I realized at that moment I did. I had to forgive these people who had hurt my people.
Yeah.
And as I forgave them, I began to understand them. It wasn't until I forgave them that I could understand them. And I could understand how they were doing things they thought were right, and that they were doing what they thought was going to make the world better, even if I didn't agree with what they did, and even if I could see hypocrisies that they couldn't. They're still working with greater. They were still trying to do good in the world, and I gave them, as you give them the benefit of the doubt, the logic of what they were doing started to become clear, and that became the basis ultimately of my dissertation. Was the logic of enforcing the standard of monogamy, and why. And ultimately, I looked at the way that happened on Indian reservations, where a lot of harm was done to Indian families as they tried to enforce kind of European standards of marriage and onto Native Americans. And I was looking at the parallels between what was happening with Latter-day Saints and what was happening with Native Americans. And so the whole dissertation came out of that moment, really. If I hadn't forgiven them, I wouldn't have had the insights that came later came from being able to let go of the anger I had towards them. And I think that's just that moment, and since I've noticed that there are historians who approach history with malice, who approach it with a chip on their shoulder, who want to prove a point, who want to settle scores. And those kinds of histories I don't think are helpful, and I don't think they're useful generally, but those who approach their subjects with charity and humility generally write the best histories. And I think it's a good model for church history. You're going to look back and you're going to find, in any human record, you're going to find instances of incredible mistakes and pain, and you have to. I've learned to apply the same principle when I run into instances in church history. Forgiveness and humility help me to see them as people struggling to find God, making mistakes, sometimes horrific mistakes like Mountain Meadows, and think they're doing it even sometimes in the defense of the kingdom and in God's name, and giving them having charity helps me to understand them, at least, even if I don't agree with them, and then ultimately to see God working with, again, very flawed people. But if you don't go in with a sense of charity and forgiveness, you're going to be angry a lot of the time at things people do.
And so let me ask you one final question, and I love that response about charity and humility. I mean, it's a great lesson for history, but it's a great lesson for everything that we do, right? As we encounter people. But just any pieces of advice that you have for people who are dealing with questions of church history.
Probably my biggest piece of advice is to always remember that the church and its leaders, from prophets down to local leaders to parents, the whole institution of the church is designed to bring us to God, but is not God. And the vehicle is always imperfect and will always stumble at times. But I think it's important to realize that our faith is not in the church. Our faith is in Jesus Christ. Our faith is in our Heavenly Father. And that the church is designed to bring us to them, but not to be the end. It's the means. And I think if sometimes I think people get clouded about that. They think that the church is somehow the end, and that our faith is in it. When our faith is really it's pointing us to where our faith should be, and it will always again be imperfect in that, because it's human, and God's working with what He has to work with, which in my case is not a lot. So He's but He still manages to do some really incredible things with pretty imperfect people. So I think there's sometimes a sense that the church has to be perfect in order to be endorsed as God's church, but I think it's the very fact that it's human means that it's never going to be, and therefore it will never meet some. If you're looking for the perfect institution, you'll never find it. Even in history,
You're right.
as wonderful of all.
Especially.
Maybe even especially in history or in the present day, right? It's always going to be a work in progress.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you for the opportunity.